Welcome to our presentation entitled Third Order Science Communication. What is it and where can I get some? We are a team of science communication professionals working in Australia and New Zealand, and today we'd like to share with you some of the insights that we've gathered from our discussions over the last 9 months or so. But first, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and on which you are listening. We recognise that this land is often not ceded, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. But first, let me tell you a story. It was a dark and stormy night. The ground is shaking. No, the water is rising. No, there's smoke infiltrating the room around their feet. No, there's smell of disease coming from the barn. That's it. It's a long-term problem coming to a head. Who does the family call for advice? The farmer. Who does the manager call for advice? Who does the liaison officer call for advice on how to respond to questions about this phenomenon? You're in the communication centre. You're interacting with the media and government agencies and responding to questions from the community. There is scientific expertise available, but different stakeholders are seeing the problem differently. And they cannot seem to reconcile competing claims about knowledge, about possible causes, and about the consequences. Some of them fight like dogs and cats. Trust seems low. There's a history here between two of the stakeholder groups, and that will make achieving any sort of consensus particularly challenging. This story is just an example of the sorts of contexts in which we work. We work in a range of complex settings with a wide array of bodies of scientific knowledge. We've found that the models of science communication that exist, even dialogue, don't fit us. In some ways, a third-order landscape that Irwin described in 2008 comes close. The problem is, though, that Irwin's conception seems to better describe the context in which we're working, but it doesn't tell us what to do. It's also not that useful in letting those up the ladder from us and others whom with we work recognise and appreciate what we are attempting to do. Irwin describes third-order thinking about science communication as beyond the familiar categories of the deficit model as well as beyond dialogue. The dialogue that's meant to feature in citizens' juries and consensus conferences can be constrained, and concerns arise about who is in control of the topics discussed, who decides what counts as a relevant fact, and what assurance do the non-expert citizens have that what they say will be heeded by decision makers. These points are neatly summarised by Wakeford in a 2010 article. He identifies Irwin's call for third-order thinking as recognition of the wicked nature of certain issues, such as the ones that we cited from our own experiences. Wakeford cites a colleague, Holt, who identifies these wicked problems as emerging from settings that are complex, with a range of intertwined causal factors, and where participants bring different perspectives and values. Additionally, there can be low levels of trust, which is often defined as competence or relevant capability, benevolence, benefiting our interests, and integrity, following through on promises. Finally, there may be no solutions to these wicked problems. In recognising that we face such wicked problems as science communication practitioners, we have, over the last 9 months, landed on 3 characteristics that seem common across our experiences. One is messiness. The second is a need for transdisciplinary approaches, bringing different schools of thought and ways of knowing to bear. The third is sorting through this morass through co-creation with an array of stakeholders. So we're observing a need for this third-order thinking about science communication in our work. But how do we convince our bosses, clients, and institutions that a newsletter or a workshop is just not enough? We hear reference amongst decision makers in science to our roles in connecting scientists and the public. To us, such phrasing sounds like fingernails scraped across a chalkboard. For those not in the room right now, as we assume that we are mainly preaching to the choir at this conference, how do we define the more challenging aspects of what we do? What is a good way to describe this third order thinking about science communication? How do we explain to scientists that their field of scientist is indeed accepted as one convincing, privileged and dominant worldview, but not the only worldview that ought to be aired or accommodated? What language or explanation acknowledges the multiple agendas at play amongst the scientists and others? How do we avoid the oversimplification that one field in science has an answer, the reductionism that fails to accommodate the fact that wicked problems have no simple answers? How do we acknowledge the pressure for resolution and expediency? In other words, how do we come up with ready explanations for what we do and what we're attempting to do, which is not just explaining science? For example, responding to climate change is not just about governments mandating that power companies stop burning coal, as that fails to account for livelihoods, energy costs, how capital investment can be redirected, who gets displaced for solar farms, and a range of other issues. We're all familiar with the abstracted nature of science, but also with other ways of knowing. It can be challenging in a scientific context to get those other ways respected, much less understood and accommodated. Scholars highlight notions of epistemic asymmetries, which are essentially manifestations of a love of what we already know and a lesser respect given to the forms of knowledge embraced by others. Cherished bodies of knowledge are signalled and celebrated in our sense of identity and how we display identity in how we engage, talk, reason and regard others. For example, there are at least 5 signals of identity in this single sentence. Groundwater in general follows the topography in this hydrogeological regime. Yes, around here groundwater flows downhill. With this regard for our own expert knowledge, the knowledge of others can be marginalised, not seen as correct, or just not seen as relevant. When we acknowledge, appreciate and include insights from other worldviews, sometimes the output is not different from what we imagined initially. However, the outcomes might change. Greater acceptance, increased trust, progress to resolve one issue and move on to another. For example, consider a biosecurity context involving farmers. One of us enabled participants to see that their voices counted, that they could push against others whom they had previously seen to be in charge. Participants recognised that they were all working towards the same goals of safe and well animals and a productive, thriving farm. One could see trust and deep relationships developing. In such instances, there is recognition of a need for transdisciplinary approaches. That includes a broad definition of what can count as a discipline or a coherent body of knowledge and way of knowing. Reflexivity becomes important as we realise that none of us is neutral. And who determines what counts as neutral anyway? We all have beliefs and perspectives. In fact, it is very dangerous, as we see in scientific research, if we think that we come to the table free of value judgment and unrestrained from our birthplace, upbringing, education and affiliations. This issue is perhaps the most challenging for science communicators. We cannot change our value or experiences, but we need to reflect on the role they may play, the tacit influences that they can have. We need to make them known and transparent and do more listening than talking. A member of our group faced such challenges in collaborating with Maori stakeholders in New Zealand. Is the word stakeholder even appropriate in their worldview? Across these ruminations, we have tried to surface challenges facing science communication at a foundational level. Certain aspects relate to the wicked problems that we often deal with. Other aspects emerge from science being such a dominant form of knowledge and institution, something that scientists cherish but that others may distrust. Still other aspects are biases that we cannot escape as humans, but can potentially expose for scrutiny. So where to from here? This presentation is a first airing of what we as a group have been sorting through for the past 9 months, so it is tentative. Ideally, we would provide a neat framework and dot points with steps to take to navigate our way through. However, that may then just bring us back to a reductionist approach to science communication and the idea that there's only one way to proceed. Instead, maybe what we need is a reminder that in our line of work, messiness and knowledge challenges and the need for deep, sometimes painful reflection, both professional and personal, are here to stay. We need to keep thinking and challenging and supporting each other, That includes creating spaces where these challenges and others still to be uncovered can be discussed. And so, to end where we began, perhaps it is always a dark and stormy night, and that wicked problems are here to stay with us. And third order thinking about science communication is probably already what you do. And if so, then we'd love to hear from you so that we can have some discussions about some of the issues that we face. In particular, let's start with that conversation, scientists and the public. Let's unpack that one sometime. We hope to hear from you soon.